Welcome to History for Granite. Join me to explore ancient Egypt. Please subscribe, and together we'll uncover secrets from the past written in stone. We are now getting close to looking at a hidden space within the Great Pyramid that nobody has seen in 4,500 years. Not the Scan Pyramid's big void above the Grand Gallery, that's coming a little later. The first attempt will be to peer behind this blocking stone at the end of the Queen's Chamber Northern Air Channel. In anticipation of that event, this video is going to address the history and controversy of the air channels in Egyptology, and also make a prediction about what might be interesting about the space beyond. If the new robot mission is successful, it may be the last chapter in the quest to observe the interior of the channels with no more hidden spaces left to probe. For those of you who like to solve puzzles on their own, I invite you to observe and ponder the Northern Channel blocking stone from the side we have seen. The most important clue about the hidden space is already visible from this side, which forms the basis of my prediction. I'll give you a hint, which is that it's not about the copper pins. But whatever may be revealed by this new robotic exploration, I fear some Egyptologists may not present the findings to the public without wild and unfounded speculations. The live TV show for the Pyramid rover drilling, and many subsequent TV documentaries, have mischaracterized the physical evidence of the channels as well as their archaeological context. I must also emphasize that I am not antagonistic towards Egyptology or archaeologists at all. My critical view of this history should not be interpreted as having an agenda against people or institutions that have investigated the pyramid. This video will reveal experts acting bizarrely and making inaccurate statements, but the purpose is not to disparage these individuals. Only by studying why and how many professionals got the air channel so wrong can a proper understanding of the Great Pyramid be achieved. If you don't yet know what the function of the air channels was, I recommend my previous video on the topic, which analyzes the physical evidence in detail. In order to build on that body of evidence, this video contains spoilers from that previous episode. Here is a very quick recap of previous investigations. Throughout the ages, curious explorers at the Great Pyramid have attempted to peer into its air channels, which intersect the upper chambers of the monument. Most of the physical damage to the openings of these channels is the result of people tunneling into them to determine where they might lead. Advancements in technology have allowed recent investigations to be less destructive, however, some damage did still occur. Since no other Egyptian pyramid contains anything like the air channels, a great deal of intrigue and speculation has accompanied recent investigations of them. The three most recent investigations all used robots to crawl up the channels, and they are the Upuat project, the Pyramid rover mission, and the Jetty robot mission. The two channels intersecting the Queen's Chamber were not fully constructed to reach the exterior of the pyramid, but instead stop about 15 meters short. They terminate with polished white limestone blocking stones, each containing 2 copper pins embedded in the center. In 2002, the Pyramid rover mission drilled through the southern channel blocking stone to reveal a small 19-centimeter gap beyond, with only regular core masonry to be seen. The following Jetty robot mission used an articulating endoscope to turn back towards the blocking stone and see the copper pins were bent into loops on the outer side. Before the 20th century, the King's Chamber channels were already well understood. They were cleared of debris by a team led by Howard Weiss in 1837, and it was proven they did not intersect any unknown chambers or passages inside the pyramid. Upon reopening these channels, the improved ventilation inside was obvious, and there was nothing left to debate about it. The Queen's Chamber channels weren't discovered until 1872 by Wayman Dixon and James Grant because they had been concealed behind a few centimeters of uncut stone. The 3 artifacts found inside them were plain and resembled tools rather than sacred relics. The upper ends of the Queen's Chamber channels remained a mystery. At least a few capable explorers searched for them, but no sign of the channels could be found on the exterior of the pyramid. In 1922, Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt published a book titled Against the Numerology at the Great Pyramid near Giza, to counter the more fanciful ideas about its design. Part of his argument was that the Great Pyramid was built in 3 stages, shown here, and as a consequence of this sequence, the Queen's Chamber channels were cut short. That same year, another Egyptologist named Alfred Wiedemann published the first paper claiming the 4 channels of the Great Pyramid were to guide the pharaoh's soul to the sky. Wiedemann claimed the southern channels were emergency exits to avoid demons, and stated the channels were not very suitable for air, despite Howard Weiss proving efficient air circulation in 1837. This is where published ideas rethinking the air channels began in Egyptology. Pyramidologist Morton Edgar had been documenting the Great Pyramid since 1909 and did not agree with Borchart's theory about the Queen's Chamber channels being so short. Although Edgar worked independently, in 1925 he obtained numerous official permissions from the Director General of the Antiquities Department to excavate portions of the Great Pyramid. Among these permissions was to clear out debris from the King's Chamber channels and to search for the upper ends of the Queen's Chamber channels. He wasn't able to inspect the Queen's Chamber channels until 1928, when he used a series of steel rods with flexible couplers to measure the southern channel at 208 feet, or about 63.4 meters in length. Edgar was unsuccessful at measuring the full northern channel because of its sharp lateral turns, but managed to probe 175 feet deep before his rods broke and remained stuck inside. Nevertheless, Edgar was delighted with his discovery and set about to correct the academic record with respect to the air channels. The Egyptologist most familiar to Edgar was George Reisner of Harvard University, whom he had encountered numerous times while working at Giza. They were on good terms. Reisner even gave Edgar permission to enter the recently opened tomb of Khufu's mother, Hatepheres, provided he signed a liability waiver. However, when Edgar went to inform Reisner of his discovery about the Queen's Chamber channels, an explosive exchange occurred. In a letter from Cairo in 1938, Edgar writes of this encounter. Edgar also had a copy of the letter sent to the Boston Museum, which still retains it in their archive. Edgar writes, quote, "When in 1936 I visited Professor Reisner at his camp, I informed him that his theory regarding the air channels of the Queen's Chamber was not according to the facts, and he claims always that it is facts he is desirous of. He nearly bit my head off, and his lady assistant, typist, frantically laid hold of me to get me out of the place. The professor had become so excited." Edgar continues, quote, "Therefore, Professor Reisner's theory about the method of building the Great Pyramid, the addition idea, is not in accordance with the facts. And it must have been the sudden realization of this which so excited Professor Reisner that he wanted to bite my head off, and explains, I suppose, why I was laid hold upon by the arm and hurried out of his presence." End quotes. Edgar recounts this exchange in the letter because a few weeks prior, he stood 6 feet from Reisner when the Egyptologist gave the first ever live radio broadcast from the Giza pyramids. In this broadcast, Reisner responds to the question of what an archaeologist hopes to prove by uncovering the ruins, and he replies, quote, "He doesn't hope to prove any theories, but to collect facts. The facts on which he reconstructs the history of the man in the valley of the Nile and reconstructs the life of people in Egypt." End quote. What's even more remarkable than Reisner's hypocrisy regarding the facts of the Queen's Chamber channels is that Reisner never documented or shared the information Edgar had brought to him. Remember, Edgar was working in an official capacity and reporting his findings to the chief Egyptologist at Giza. There was no excuse to dismiss what he was saying. But giving a pyramidologist credit for a major discovery was evidently a bridge too far. And so, for over half a century, Egyptology was unaware of what Edgar had found. It wasn't until 1993 that the length of the Queen's Chamber Southern Channel was rediscovered by engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink. I won't retell the full story of Gantenbrink's project, but if you want more details, I recommend the archived version of his website at the Isida Project, which is linked in the description. Gantenbrink worked with Egyptologist Rainer Stadelmann and under the authority of Zahi Hawass. Gantenbrink writes these collaborations were productive and positive until immediately after the discovery of the Queen's Chamber southern channel blocking stone. Less than a week after this discovery, disagreements had escalated to the point of Gantenbrink withdrawing from the joint project. Gantenbrink was later accused of having violated some protocol of disclosure, but I have not found Hawass or Stadelman to ever specify what Gantenbrink said, which was unauthorized. Here is a press interview with Stadelman from the following year, explaining his objections to Gantenbrink.
He thinks one discovers a room with treasures, and even if he does not admit it openly, he always talks about what is behind this slab, he says, or this door. This is not a door.
Do you think there's anything behind the stone?
No, there's nothing behind.
However, Stadelman's opinion of the blocking stone was not universal. A month after the discovery in 1993, an article in the UK Times quotes another prominent Egyptologist and pyramid specialist, I.E.S. Edwards, as stating, quote, "Obviously, you do not have a stone blocking an entrance like that unless there is something behind it." End quote. About 9 years later, during the subsequent Pyramid rover mission to investigate the blocking stone, Stadelman seems to have changed his mind.
It might be possible that there is, let's say, a papyrus roll or something behind these stones.
I think it's fair to say Stadelman's previous objections were an excuse to dismiss his former colleague rather than an honest assessment of the evidence. Every publication says Gantenbrink simply wanted to continue investigating by slipping a fiber optic camera under a chipped corner of the blocking slab. He didn't propose anything so bold as drilling through the block. That idea would come from the Pyramid rover mission in 2002 as led by Zahi Hawass. In an article by Hawass titled "The Secret Doors Inside the Great Pyramid," he explains how he came to be the leader of this mission, writing, quote, "The German Institute in Cairo had the concession to the Great Pyramid, and I could see that they were not interested in completing the work on the shafts. It was impossible to assign the concession to Gantenbrink as he is an individual, and the antiquities law in Egypt only allows for concessions to be granted to institutions. So I decided that the Supreme Council of Antiquities would do the work instead." End quote. This project would culminate in 2002 with a live TV broadcast titled Into the Great Pyramid. This show is when a camera would look behind the blocking slab for the first time. The program was filled with bizarre statements, such as Hawass claiming it was the first time they had used a robot.
But this is a serious scientific investigation, isn't it?
Yes, the first time actually that you have a high-tech robot working with us archaeology.
But no moment may ever surpass the reaction Zahi Hawass gave when the camera probes behind the blocking stone for the first time. Let's watch it again for the full context.
What are we seeing, Zahi?
We can see another sealed door.
Another sealed door?
Yeah.
And what are these markings on the door? There seems to be some black marks, or is that a crack?
It's cracks.
Wow.
In another sealed door. And
Oh my goodness.
it's another space, another sealed door, but it looks to me we have a discovery.
Now, I don't think live TV is conducive to making new interpretations, and normally one could excuse any mistake Hawass made in that moment. If after thoughtful consideration he altered his interpretation, that would be totally reasonable. However, to this day, over 23 years later, Hawass has never admitted to making a mistake and always claims the core masonry seen here is a sealed door of some kind. In fact, he even goes further to claim that the door is some key to a secret revelation of treasure or Khufu's burial hidden in the pyramid.
These doors reveals more secrets to the pyramids. We are looking forward to see what kind of treasures are hidden behind these doors.
The burial chamber, the secret chamber of Cheops, is still inside the pyramid. And these doors could be a mark of the location of the chamber.
This is quite the claim. I've only found one other person who talks about the air channels like Hawass does. That would be this guy, Eric von Denigen, author of Chariots of the Gods, and often described as a pioneer of modern pseudoarchaeology. Have a quick listen and see if you notice any similarities.
So behind the first door, 23 centimeters, second door. Now we are behind the second door. What is inside? That's what you see here. Another room. So we know there are rooms inside the pyramid. Definitely. And there are more than one room. You know, there are many holes, many rooms, many shafts inside the pyramid. It's a bunch of holes and rooms.
I'll let you guys decide for yourselves why Hawass and von Däniken share this idea about the Great Pyramid with respect to what the air channels reveal. It's also time for me to address the spiritual, soul-traveling explanation for the air channels first proposed by Wiedemann in 1922. So you don't have to take my word for it. I recommend this peer-reviewed journal paper by Egyptologist Rolf Krauss, published in 2019, which is linked in the description. Krauss systematically dismantles every aspect of the soul-traveling theory, even pointing out how the stars in the later pyramid texts are not even the same ones the channels would allegedly point to. Krauss also states, quote, "To avoid missing the culminations, a glorified king would have needed a clock accurate to the minute, which did not exist in pharaonic Egypt." End quote. Let's not forget that the King's Chamber channels were likely never pointed towards the sky in the first place. The primary source says they turned parallel to the ground in a section that is now destroyed. However, the most important flaw in the spiritual explanation for the channels is that it betrays everything Egyptologists know about art and architecture in ancient Egypt. As Krauss states, quote, "The concept of model corridors seems strange. For example, Egyptologists are familiar with dummy vessels, but the Cheops canals are not dummy vessels, but real ones." End quote. Indeed, false doors and statues are barely skin deep. There is no need to make a corridor behind a false door, nor does a statue require a skeleton or organs inside of it. This was well understood even in the time of Borchardt and Reisner, and this is why they assumed dummy channels wouldn't go up into the pyramid. Once Egyptologists selectively break the rules of their own discipline, any far-fetched interpretation can be put forth. Watch that happen in this clip with Egyptologist Salima Ikram. A random hole underneath Djoser's pyramid where stones have collapsed is transformed into something significant.
It looks really narrow.
It's very confined, and it just continues up as far as we can see.
So it sort of goes up like a chimney?
It looks like a chimney.
So you mean this is like the passages in the Great Pyramid, so this would be a precursor?
It's facing north as well.
Really?
And they like it to face north.
Yeah, of course, that's the entryway, that's the North Star, that's where you become one with the stars. Oh, how nice.
Once you start going down that path, archaeology and pseudoarchaeology are no longer distinguishable. Notably, it was not any Egyptologists, but instead independent researchers such as Gilles Dormian or John Leggen who made accurate predictions about what would be found on the other side of the Queen's Chamber blocking stone. They each proposed the copper pins would form something like a handle on the exterior side of the slab, which was proven to be correct in 2011. Egyptologists in favor of the soul channel theory have yet to explain why a pharaoh would need handles to get back inside the pyramid rather than escape it. Even more negligent is that supporters of the soul channel theory never bothered to scrutinize the physical evidence they used to support their ideas. In his book, The Great Pyramid of Giza, Rainer Stadelmann wrote of the King's Chamber channels, quote, "The ducts were certainly not intended to supply air to the chamber, for they were most likely closed off by the casing blocks on the outside and by granite plugs on the inside, of which, admittedly, nothing has been found." End quote. If Stadelmann had searched for evidence of plugging inside the King's Chamber northern air channel, he might have discovered that he had it exactly backwards. The coup de grace in the air channel debate was my discovery that the King's Chamber channels were originally left sealed and then cut open later. This rounded corner intersecting the otherwise flat saw cut shows that the mouth of the channel was cut separately. This perfectly explains why the air channels of the Queen's Chamber were found uncut at the chamber and don't quite reach the outside of the pyramid. They were unfinished, just like the Queen's Chamber itself. The real lesson of this video, however, is why Egyptology has so badly grappled with the air channels for at least a century. Perhaps Rainer Stadelmann is the best person to make this case for me. He writes in his 1994 paper about Gantenbrink's discovery, quote, "This decisively refutes the old, long controversial explanation of these shafts as air ducts, as well as all recent attempts to interpret these shafts as light shafts or even as water locks of an ancient power plant." End quote. I'm not aware of any Egyptological interpretations of an ancient power plant, thus Stadelmann reveals his true motivation is to prove pyramidologists wrong. Just like the earliest papers on this topic from 1922 and countless others since, the framing was to counter alternative explanations for the Great Pyramid. This explains behavior all the way back to when Reisner lost his temper with Morton Edgar in 1936. The concept of air channels within a tomb was not something many Egyptologists could ever accept. So despised was the tomb versus not a tomb debate that most Egyptologists were unwilling to face the question, why does a tomb need air channels in the first place? Of course, having air channels doesn't mean Khufu wasn't buried in this sarcophagus, and it doesn't make any pyramidologist theory more correct. Egyptology is fortunate that I've already worked through the difficult ramifications of the air channels being built for air, and I recommend my video on the topic, which solves all of those problems. The reason many Egyptologists have failed with the air channels for the past century is their goal was to win a debate against pseudoarchaeology. This video reveals what happens when winning an argument or gaining fame is more important than searching for the truth. In that context, you can see how counterproductive the archaeology culture war is, which is the main attraction on so many other YouTube channels. Whenever I see questions online asking why Egyptologists don't respond to my work, I always think back to that 1994 interview of Stadelmann criticizing Rudolf Gantenbrink.
He is like a child who is playing with things. He does not know that this needs years of studying and years of experience.
I can't help but notice Stadelmann's years of studying and experience hardly improved upon the soul channel theory Wiedemann first proposed in 1922. This is a good time to mention that Stadelmann's three-chamber pyramid theory, which I refuted in this video, was also proposed by Wiedemann in that same 1922 paper. Stadelmann, however, explicitly claimed it as his own idea in 1991. The Great Pyramid soul channel theory was expanded upon by Egyptologists Alexander Badawi in 1953 and Virginia Trimble in 1964. In his paper Critical of the Soul Channel Theory, Rolf Krauss writes, quote, "The Badawi-Trimble thesis found its way into Egyptological and archaeoastronomical literature without critical reservation. In Mark Lehner's 2017 book on the Giza Pyramids, the most recent publication on the subject, the names Badawi and Trimble do not appear." Krauss also elaborates, quote, "John A.R. Legan criticized the astronomical approach in a series of articles in the 1990s. The established pyramid specialists do not cite the independent researcher, perhaps for sociological reasons." End quotes. Remember, Krauss is an Egyptologist, and this is a peer-reviewed paper, so perhaps skeptics of my own commentary will listen to him instead. I will elaborate on Krauss to say that sociological reasons explain much about how scholars discuss the Great Pyramid. So great is the pull of this famous structure that it has bent the thinking of prominent Egyptologists towards whatever served their self-interest. The manifestations of that are most visible on TV, and this brings me back to televised revelations of the Queen's Chamber air channels. The 2002 TV show was a catastrophe. not because there was nothing to be seen behind the blocking stone, but because the Egyptologists told a story that was not based in evidence. And when that story led nowhere, the public was left confused and disappointed. But when the sequel to that show arrives soon, everyone who has watched this video will be well prepared. Maybe it will be another live show to peer behind the other blocking stone, or maybe it will just be a press conference afterwards. Whatever the case, you now have the context to evaluate any claims made about a discovery. When it comes to the Great Pyramid, claims of a discovery are often more about who is making the claim rather than what has been revealed. Let's now finish by discussing what we might find behind the other Queen's Chamber air channel blocking stone. As you've probably guessed, we should expect something very similar to what we've already seen behind the south slab. A short distance of empty space before the channel ends at rough core masonry inside the pyramid. If the camera angle can view the copper pins, they should also look very similar. There is one detail about the blocking slab that we might get lucky with, and that is how it is embedded into the channel. Let's clear up one more mistake from the 2002 Pyramid Rover TV show as we discuss this.
So from this chip at the bottom corner, you can see the shadows, and you can see very clearly that this stone is sitting in a vertical groove in the side wall. And that's very good news, because that is what you would do if this were actually a door that was slid into the place from above.
In fact, there's a space and then another slab could indicate that these are little model portcullis slabs, such as they block the passage into the king's chamber, little sliding doors, as symbolic closure of these passages going down into the queen's chamber.
The block with copper pins was not slid into place from above. The Jetty robot mission in 2011 was able to observe superficial cracks in the ceiling of the channel that span both sides of the slab. The only thing supporting the slab is a 3mm ledge in the west wall and an unknown amount of groove in the east wall. The channel was not sealed like a model portcullis or anything of the sort. The only way for the slab to be inserted into the channel was to wedge it in from behind. A slightly rougher surface on the west wall behind the slab is evidence the end of the channel was tapered slightly to accommodate the tight-fitting blocking stone. This was also a finding presented by the Jetty robot mission. This tight fit explains the need for copper loops on the exterior of the block. In order to free the block, you would need to rock it side to side against the channel. The copper loops aligned this way allow something like the claw end of a modern hammer to give leverage in a lateral direction. The copper hook found inside the channel looks exactly like the kind of tool one would expect to accomplish that task. A tight seal prevents intrusion from rain and sand into the air channel while the pyramid is being constructed. In the early 1990s, Gantenbrink also discovered grooves in the side walls of the King's Chamber southern air channel. These grooves would accomplish the same task of supporting a blocking stone inside it. The slab would have about the same thickness, and it was also about the same distance from the temporary end of the channel. If a slab had been left permanently inside the King's Chamber southern channel, it could not have been removed until modern times, but Weiss and Paring found no such thing when they first cleared the channel in 1837. This brings us to what I hope we might find behind the undisturbed blocking stone in the Queen's Chamber northern channel. As seen from the front, the slab is only supported by the side walls. The gap above it, where the camera will probe through, already shows that this block is not supported at the top. Behind this blocking stone, we should see evidence in the walls of the channel that show how it was wedged into place. This will give us one more frame of reference to compare it to the King's Chamber channel grooves that were probably used for the same purpose. In doing so, we can see how both chambers had channels designed the same way with temporary closures at both ends. The critical difference is that the Queen's Chamber was left unfinished, and thus its channels remained entirely sealed. It's possible this blocking stone is wedged the same as the southern one with very little to see behind it, but at least you'll know what to look for. With these expectations, the new peek behind this stone should be an enjoyable experience. Fantasies about sacred magical doors or secret burials nearby can be dismissed and are not serious lines of inquiry. The real treasure is what the air channels teach us about the unfinished Queen's Chamber and how the need for ventilation reveals the intended function of the Great Pyramid. The builders of the Great Pyramid would not have built air channels for the Queen's Chamber if the air was only required for a final burial in the King's Chamber. The Queen's Chamber needed to be entirely sealed beneath the floor of the Grand Gallery for the granite plugs to slide down the ascending passage. Therefore, ventilation in this room was planned as a contingency, but this scenario was never implemented, and the Queen's Chamber was probably unused. This brings us back to that great question: why does a tomb need air channels? Not for workers, not for a funeral, but for a grander vision of eternal life that changed ancient Egypt forever. And if you visit Egypt and make your way into the King's Chamber, you can be a part of that vision, which is the reason why this pyramid was always known to be the greatest one of all. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Please subscribe to the channel to see more of this content. Give a like or comment as you see fit. And above all, remember to ask your friends if they take their history for granted.